Hello, I'm the Autism Dad, Victor Antunez, and this is the Autism Podcast. Today's conversation is with Dr. Michael Alessandri. Dr. Alessandri is the Executive Director of CARD, the Center for Autism and Related Disabilities. He's also a professor of psychology at the University of Miami. And for over 41 years, he's been working on behalf of the autistic and their families. Michael, welcome.
Thanks, Victor. Good to be here.
So glad to have you here. We've known each other now for a few months.
Yeah.
In that time, you've become a superhero for me, as I'm sure you are for many other fathers.
Thank you.
Now, every superhero has got an origin story. Yours began when you were 17 at summer camp, when you met Marlin, an African-American boy with classical autism, as you said. And it was in that moment that you told your parents, this is what I want to do with my life. What was it about Marlin in that moment that just clicked for you?
Well, someone's done his homework, so good, good job. You know, I think I had never experienced a human connection like I experienced with Marlin, and it just confounded me as a person. I mean, I was only 17, so I had a limited life experience, but I knew in the moment with Marlin that what I was experiencing was not something I'd ever experienced before, and it was so compelling that I just wanted to keep being engaged with people with autism. I think for me, what was hard to reconcile was how disconnected he looked from me and from other people in our environment, but how connected I felt with him. And so there's just something powerful about human connection when it doesn't look like the traditional way humans connect, right? We make eye contact, we kind of listen to each other, we orient our bodies toward each other. But Marlin was not doing any of those things, but yet I felt this kind of emotional depth of a connection with him. And it's interesting because I've experienced that many times since then. The next major time was when I was in California. I'd become a professor and I opened up a center there. And I was at a movie theater with another client. We used to do Day in the Life with Dr. Michael. And we went to see The Lion King. And he was not paying attention at all, this boy. We were watching The Lion King and just squirming in his seat, moving around, fidgeting. And then in the middle of the scene where the Lion King's father gets, trampled, he turned in his seat, he stared at the screen, and he reached for my hand. And it was just a magical moment, and it reminded me of that initial connection I had with Marlin. So it's just, reconciling what people think is social and emotional engagement and what it really feels like when you have it authentically was really powerful for me.
That's amazing. Sometimes with my daughter, I get the same thing. I don't get the traditional, like, Daddy, I love you. But every now and then, I'll get a look or a hug or even just like a sound out of her that I know we're connected. I know she loves me, just not traditional way. So I can understand why you had this connection with Marlin, because it's very powerful when we have these very unique experiences, like the one you had with Marlin. And I'm assuming he was nonverbal because you said he was classically autistic.
Correct.
Just because that's my daughter as well.
Yeah.
So
I haven't met her yet, so
you will meet her.
Forward.
You will meet her. She's an enchantress. People love my daughter, even though she can't communicate in traditional ways.
Autism's it's endlessly fascinating. Yes. I think what you're describing with your daughter, what I went through with my clients, it's if you allow yourself to feel that kind of human connection, it's really powerful. My grandmother, when I was a really little kid, used to say I had an angel on my shoulder because kids were always gravitating towards me. There was just something about my energy and my ability to connect with all of these kids that has been there for a long time. So I'm just thankful that, I found this path, or the path found me. Autism really found me.
Speaking of the path found you, 17 years old, that's quite young to know what you want to do, because most people, they're in their 20s, 30s, or beyond, and they still haven't got it figured out. And you had to figure it out at 17. So it's just like, I think that, you were touched by an angel because you've done some amazing work, 44 years now. That's got to be that's got to be a record. So
it's a lot of years. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
I think I don't know. Who knows? I'm not sure I knew in that moment that I would be who I am today, obviously, but I knew I wanted this energy in my life every day. There was just something authentic, something genuine about the connection with this person with autism, and even at 17, I knew that wasn't every interaction that I was having with humanity. So now I'm sure it's even more compelling, to be with people who are just genuinely invested in you and that connection, like you have with your daughter.
Yes,
there's nothing like it.
Now, you talked about a day in the life of Dr. Michael Alessandri. Does it ever wear on you that, you're this man about town, everybody knows you? I'm sure when you're out to having lunch or dinner with your family and friends, you probably get people comment all the time. What does it feel like to be Dr. Michael Alessandri?
Well, that is a running joke in my household. We can't get on a plane or a cruise or go to a restaurant without having some, people that we've made these connections with. And yeah, I'm grateful for that. I always tell everyone there's no separation between my personal life and my private life, my personal life and my work life, because, what I tell my team at Card is you can't do this work well unless you become part of the family. So for me, all of these people are just part of my extended family. But it feels gratifying to have built, a career and have a reputation that's as good as mine is, because I do take care of people and I am responsive to people's needs. And I think people understand that the connection I had with Marlin is now the connection they're having with me. That genuine, authentic, human connection is everything to me. I'm 24/7. The phone's always on, responding to emails 2, 3, 4 in the morning sometimes. Take calls when families are in crisis. We've had families who've had kids with seizures in the middle of the night, kids where families where the cops show up in the middle of the night because the child's having some challenging behaviors. And I like that I'm the lifeline for a lot of these families. That, there's nothing better than knowing that people count on you and can count on you.
Speaking of these challenging behaviors, some kids are more challenging than others. What do you tell to the parents who are going through this? Does it get better?
Well, I think we tell them it gets better because it generally does get better. And actually, over the 44 years of my career, I can say that, what families experience now and what they get in terms of early identification, early intervention, and just the support systems around them is much, much better than it was certainly in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, in the early, it sounds crazy to say, the early decades of my career. But we can't dismiss the reality that there are a lot of families still in crisis. We have a better system of care, but we don't have a system of care that works equally for everyone. So the kids with more severe intellectual impairments, the kids with more significant and profound behavioral disturbances, we still have a hard time finding schools, have a hard time finding providers, have a hard time getting respite care to give the families a break. It's harder for those families to see a path forward. So I think we as a community still have a responsibility to figure that out and to do better. But yeah, there's always hope. Kids are getting better every day thanks to early detection and early intervention. But autism's complex, and the range of symptom presentations that you see is it's kind of bewildering how complex it is and how broad the spectrum is. And so I think what I have to keep reminding the community of is, and even me in my center, is that we have to take care of the whole spectrum, and we have to do better when it comes to those with most significant, profound and severe autism.
I've also heard you speak that the outcomes are getting better than they were earlier. What's changed that outcomes are getting better?
Well, the early detection is the most important thing. Years ago, kids were not diagnosed until much later than they are now, maybe 6, 7. And now the average age is between 4 and 5, but we can actually diagnose autism at 18 months or 24 months. So the earlier you get a diagnosis, the earlier you can get into high-quality, intensive intervention, and then generally the outcomes are more favorable. Early intervention is the key. So and in order to get into early intervention, you have to have early detection. We've just onboarded a new technology at UM that was developed out of the Marcus Center in Atlanta, which allows us to use eye tracking technology, basically children looking at a computer screen for about 15 minutes. And we have a pretty good detection rate of autism in 16 months to 30-month-olds, which is kind of mind-boggling that we're at that point. So you can see a time where devices like that may be scattered throughout pediatric offices and child developmental centers, and we'll be able to find these kids who are at risk much earlier. Because it's still taking too long. It's still taking too long. And wait lists are, since COVID especially, you can wait 6 to 9 months for a diagnostic evaluation. And that's just unacceptable.
Yeah. The diagnostic did take us a few months, although I will say the evaluation at Fiddler's, that was almost instantaneous, and maybe it was like a 2 or 3 month wait, which I thought that was pretty reasonable.
Did you flow through CARD for that? Because we have a grant with Children's Trust that allows us to see some of these kids who are at risk for autism through Fiddler's and early steps, but maybe not.
Well, I have my sister-in-law. She's a psychologist at Fiddler's, so she just put me in direct contact with Fiddler's. Good. Now, you talk about this eye tracking software, but I'm curious because my daughter, she was born very typical. And then around 2.5 years old, there was a severe regression, change in her personality. Do you think that with children like her, that this eye tracking technology would still work?
Probably.
Really?
Yeah, probably. I think, the natural progression of many cases, if not most cases of autism, is that there is some regression. There's like, you have some language skills, maybe some words, some kids maybe even some short phrases. And then, right at 18 months or so, you see a little bit of a regressive presentation. Now, it depends on, I don't know your daughter yet, and I don't know her specific symptom presentation, but it isn't uncommon to see a period of development and then a period of regression. And sometimes that's coexisting with like a seizure disorder or something more neurological. But in other cases, I mean, it's not. There are some kids who have no words and then really struggle to develop speech. And then there are those kids who develop some words and then lose those words around 18 to 24 months. So it's not uncommon. But I think there are what we tell parents is there are other aspects of development that are more indicative of autism than whether the child is speaking or not. And those are the nonverbal signs of communication. Do they make eye contact? Do they respond when you call their name? Can they gesture for things? Do they point? Those kinds of behaviors are more indicative of whether or not a child will, develop autism than whether or not the speech is in place yet at an early age.
My wife and I, we went through this, now that you're saying it, because when our daughter had this regression, that's what the word I use, we saw this marked change in her personality and her behaviors, but we were first-time parents, so we just thought, oh, how cute, because, at that age, everything's cute. It was actually my mother-in-law who read us a riot. I said, you know what, there's something off with your daughter. You need to have her looked at. Now, we weren't in denial. We just didn't know what we didn't know. So how could we educate parents? Because if it wasn't for my mother-in-law, her evaluation would have been later. And like you said, early intervention, better outcomes. How do we educate the general public about these things?
Yeah, I mean, it's something we've been doing for decades, and it's never enough.
No.
I think, people need to understand, and we need to do a better job of telling people about these nonverbal early social communication signs of autism. In some cases, I think they're there by 12 months, but we're not detecting them until much later. There's something called joint attention, where you look at another person, and if I want to get your attention if I want your attention to shift to something else, I might look over there, look back at you, look over there, right? I'm getting you nonverbally to look at another external object or event. Kids develop that between 9 and 15 months, but kids with autism really are lacking in that skill, and sometimes, or it's delayed. So there are these early signs and symptoms that are nonverbal, but only specialists really have the capacity to detect them because we haven't really educated the broader community as well as we should. There's some great new online tools for families now that one's called the Baby Navigator, the other one's called the Autism Navigator, which are beautiful because they show side-by-side videos of a child who turns out to be neurotypical and a child who turns out to have autism. And you can see the differences 9 months, 12 months, 15 months in some of the behaviors that the kids with autism actually are exhibiting relative to what neurotypical development looks like. That's very helpful because parents can see, right? Because you talk about joint attention, you talk about using words, what I just described, but that's not the same as seeing it, in a video format. And we even have developed some screening tools that have pictures. Does your child do this or this? Because you've probably taken some surveys where it asks you if your child does something, but seeing the behavior visually is completely different.
Yeah, that would have been helpful, but just getting it.
They're out there. It's just getting them disseminated.
Yeah. Now, 44 years, you've seen a lot of changes. Are there things that maybe you believed a decade ago or two that now you no longer believe?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. Actually, I'm not sure how to answer that. I think most things that I believed, even in the early stages of my career, have been consistent throughout my career and have been supported by the way we research and study autism. So, I've always thought autism was fundamentally a genetic disorder. That was always something that I believed when I was in college. I was actually studying schizophrenia initially, and even though I was doing clinical work with autism, the schizophrenia genetic research that I was doing seemed like a good framework for maybe to apply to the autism population. And what I was thinking is that, it might be possible if it were a genetic disorder to demonstrate that there might be some subtle deficits in the siblings of children with autism, even if they don't have autism. And I actually did my master's thesis on this. And then years later now, we have pretty good evidence that autism is genetic and that there is a higher risk in siblings. There's about a 20% recurrence risk in siblings than you would expect in the general population. So those kinds of things have held up. I think maybe the one big surprise is the proliferation of applied behavior analysis now that we see throughout the world of autism, which I think is generally a good thing. It's what I was trained to do. But once they passed the insurance mandates in all 50 states, then you really saw the explosion of this particular therapy. And I think on the one hand, while it's good that there's an evidence-based practice that's available through insurance to the masses, there are other interventions as well that I think offer some tidbits of truth in terms of the comprehensive treatment plan. So speech therapy, occupational therapy, music therapy, even though the evidence is less for some of those because they're not as well studied, it's clear to me that it's really about just putting a package together for an individual child, and a little bit of different elements of treatment I think could go a long way to rounding out that child. And then just seeing the, now, like there's a lot of kids are going to school with RBTs, they're registered behavior technicians. People are receiving 35, 40 hours a week of ABA. I mean, that's something you really couldn't have predicted on this scale back certainly not in the 80s or 90s.
I hadn't thought to ask you about this, but now you bring it up. The ABA, I've read articles that with the insurance mandate, that it might be getting in the way of other therapies. What do you think about that?
Well, I think the reality is that families are strapped financially.
Yes.
Being able to provide everything that your doctor recommends to your child is nearly impossible. And so you take advantage of the things that are covered by insurance when they're covered. And ABA is a therapy that is covered, and it is covered by many providers at a fairly high level of intensity. So I think that's really the explanation. And I think when you're doing 25 to 40 hours a week of ABA, you don't really have a lot of opportunity to do other things if your child's 4, 5, 6, or 7. Now, I'm not saying the child doesn't need that, but it does at times interfere with being able to access other things, just logistically and financially. But I like a more multidisciplinary approach for the clients that we work with. I just think having a team, having different points of view, having a different kind of cocktail, if you will, of therapies is really helpful. I think, and maybe you do it at different stages, right? Maybe you do intensive ABA in the first couple of years of treatment, and then as the kids move to school, you add in a little speech, you add in a little OT. In some cases, we recommend the family start with speech and OT and then move to ABA, because we want to make sure the child is engaging in social communication skills, has some emotion regulation before they move into a lot of that more drill-like instruction. So it really just depends on the child. One of the things that we, I think, do really well is try to help families figure out what to do first, what to do next, right, and how to plan in terms of the treatments that are available. Very personalized.
Yes, of course, because each kid is different. And I see it at my daughter's school. They're all just completely different. Now, Michael, at a dad's group, a couple of dads were talking about these alternative therapies. Now we're talking about money, and they're quite expensive. And you made the comment to try to put things in perspective, that you have some very wealthy clients, maybe even billionaires, that have flown their kids all over the world for therapies, and some have seen a difference, some have seen nothing. So to parents that are thinking about going over this very expensive economic cliff, like what would be your words to them to just put things in perspective?
I always tell parents when they have limited resources, they should stick with the evidence-based practices, the things that we know work because of decades of research. So applied behavior analysis would be, the number one in that category. Now, if families want to do other things that are not evidence-based, and there are many out there in the autism community, there's a lot of snake oil.
Yes.
But, at the end of the day, I tell parents, don't do anything that causes potential harm, that's potentially harmful. Don't do anything that's harmful. Don't do anything that will bankrupt you. And don't do anything that compromises the fundamental, foundational therapies that your child needs. So to me, that's the key. I mean, we're a university-based center for autism, right? So we're always going to lean on science. We're going to be grounded in what the research tells us. And there are moments in our work where parents don't agree with the science or don't believe the science. And we have to also support them through that. Like, we can't just impose our judgment on families in terms of the course they want to take for their child. So we try to support them by giving them the information as we understand it. And at the end of the day, families get to make their own choices.
Yeah, and I think it's great that you say this, because The last thing I think that we want is families that don't have the means to be thinking they're failing their children because they can't send them to Europe or Costa Rica or Panama for some of these therapies that just not only are not evidence-based, but they might actually be harmful. So it's great that
we try to guide people through these decisions, and I think it's really important that families don't compromise what works with something that is a miracle cure or hope. I just worry that people play on our families' hopes and dreams,
Yes.
right? And I'm very protective of this community. I'm very protective of the clients we work with, and so I'm very guarded about anything that is experimental. I think it's a wait and see. I understand the compulsion and the passion that parents have to try anything that might work, but you have to really be kind of you have to be scientific about it, right? You have to be systematic about how you try different things and how you evaluate whether they're working. Because someone could fly to Panama or wherever to do a treatment, but they're also still doing the treatment here. The child's also still in school. The child's also maturing.
Mm-hmm.
It may have been the treatment, or it may have just been the fact that all the other things are in place too. So without a careful approach to it, you never know what's working.
Mm-hmm.
And when you never know what's working, you wind up getting stuck doing everything. And that's also not helpful if you can, kind of edit and make the child more successful.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, 44 years, you've seen also the language evolve and change as neurodivergent, inclusion, acceptance, awareness. Is there anything missing from the conversation that you wish was there?
I don't know. I think that's an interesting question too. You've got good questions, Victor.
Thank you.
I think awareness was really important in its day. I think acceptance was really important in its day. I think now we're all about action.
Action.
We have enough awareness. Everybody knows someone with autism. We know that. We have acceptance. It's growing.
Mm-hmm.
People are, understanding autism more. We have in our community, as you well know, because I see you at every event, we have lots of autism-friendly community partners, including the libraries and the airport and the parks. But there's not enough action on the issues that really matter to families, right? Insurance benefits, access to high-quality education, the shortage of therapists, the shortage of doctors, social and recreational opportunities. They're so limited. Lack of camps, the lack of just fun things on the weekend, right? Like we're still lacking in a lot of those areas. And I also am very concerned about health and well-being. A lot of our kids go through school, get a good education, get good therapy, and then they end up sitting at home as adults, right? So they're not as actively engaged. So I would like us to talk more about health, wellness, well-being as a lifelong kind of goal, right? Mm-hmm. Starting from the earliest ages so that these kids develop healthy eating habits, healthy exercise habits, fitness, and that way they're healthier when they become adults. And what we're seeing now, we're seeing high rates of cognitive decline, dementia in older populations of autistic people, diabetes, obesity, cancers. Like the medical risks are also quite compelling right now. And the research, I think, will shift to looking at those things. But we've been focused with adults on so many other things like housing and employment and life after high school. I mean, you can understand why people are focused on those things, but we're now starting to see the residual effects of unhealthy lifestyles leading up to adulthood. So maybe that.
Something that concerns me is that as these kids age out of the system, at 22, they're out of the school system. I've heard different numbers. From 97 to 93% of adult autistic people are unemployed and unemployable. And that concerns me. First, there's the decline in cognitive abilities and their health, because if you're at home, like, what are you doing? You're eating, sitting on the sofa. And everybody, no matter where they are in life, I think wants to feel like they're taking part and making their own little difference. And I've talked to these directors of different adult workforce programs like WOW that get these people ready for the workforce. And they say that they're getting them ready. When they get them hired, they're phenomenal employees. Everybody loves them. I mean, here at community newspapers, they have 2 autistic individuals and everybody loves them. They've changed the culture, but these centers can't get them hired. So, speaking of action, how do we get these people hired?
Well, we need to create more strategic partnerships with the employers. One of our partners, the DeMoya Foundation, is doing a great job at this. They're creating employer partnerships that facilitate the identification of jobs or the creation of jobs for all these young adults who are waiting in the wings for a meaningful opportunity. I also am chairman of the board of the Els for Autism Foundation, which is in Jupiter. We have a major initiative called You Can Employ, where we essentially are working directly with large employers, including some national companies, that will work with us on everything from how to write a job ad to recruit an autistic adult, how to do an interview to make sure that the autistic adult gets a fair shake, and then also how to support that adult going forward inside the workplace with peer supports and training and everything else. So there are opportunities to build, but we need more buy-in from the big corporations, the multinational global corporations, because we can do the one-offs. Like we can put 2 adults
Of course.
in a place like this. We can hire some folks at the University of Miami. But until everyone buys in and sets some goals, I think, like every corporation should have some goals. For what percentage of their population do they want to be people with intellectual and developmental disabilities? That's what I'd like to see. Because without goals, you're just doing the one-offs and you're doing the feel-good thing. Like we hired this adult with autism, yay for us. Like that's what's happening still. But it needs to be more systemic, and there need to be more incentives to businesses for doing this. There are some already. There are some tax incentives and other business incentives, but there needs to be more, I think. And so this is going to be something that we have to tackle ground up, but also from the top down in terms of legislature and just passing new laws.
So, okay. So I'm getting the 2-minute warning.
That's fast.
Yeah, it was fast. So I want to ask you about these incentives, because I think that we can incentivize these big employers to hire these people. So what would, if we were talking to a politician right now, what would these incentives look like?
It's good for the bottom line. The return on investment is pretty clear to me. I've worked with some businesses that have been able to actually do better in terms of their bottom line. One company told me that they had such a high level of liability insurance that once they started employing adults with autism, people were following the rules so well that they were able to lower their liability insurance because they weren't having issues in the workplace. Other folks have told me that people are so oriented to detail, so detail-oriented in their work when they have autism, that they're finding efficiencies in the work. So we had one client that we were working with, I think it was a scanning business, and they onboarded an autistic adult with our support, and the error rate went down to less than like 1% or something when it was much higher before. So their efficiencies is better return on investment, better bottom line. The feel-good part of it is not unimportant.
No, it's not. It's very important.
I think it's important for the workplace. I think it's important for the community. I think it makes the culture of a business better, stronger, because I see it in our workplace. We have probably 4 or 5 adults that work with us. And it just makes the work richer, and I think all the businesses we work with, once they do it, they're on board. I've never had a business that we've worked with that has said, "Oh, we can't do this," after they tried. Once they try, they're in. And so we just need to do more of that. We need people like you spreading the good word. We need businesses. If anyone watches this and has a business and they want to employ an adult with an intellectual or developmental disability, just call me.
Call you.
I got 18,000 of them.
Well, speaking of, if these employers did want to get a hold of you, what would be the best way to do that?
Best way is just email, Alessandri at Miami.edu. We have over 18,000 clients at Card. Over half of them are 16 and over. So we have a workforce ready to go.
That's great.
They just the businesses need more support.
And so the listeners know, being a client of Card is free.
Everything's free that we do at Card. We're funded by the Florida Department of by the legislature through the Department of Education to support any family member in South Florida who has a loved one with autism. Actually, it's a Florida program. So there's 7 Card centers around the state, all university-based, so all grounded in science, but with the mission of just simply taking care of people. It's not a center where people come. It's a center where you come for information and resources, case management, referrals. And I think we're doing a good job.
You're doing a great job. And the dads group that we're in is fantastic. I certainly appreciate it.
I love it. Thank you.
Jessica, I appreciate you being here.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Michael. Well, this has been the Autism Podcast. I want to leave you some final words from Frederick Douglass. It is easier to build strong children than to fix broken men. This is Autism Podcast. Thank you so much.